If you were with us last week and the week before, you'd know that we are currently in a series on the book of Ruth. Really a story centered around Naomi and her daughter-in-law Ruth. Last week I finished with a challenge that really Paul showed as an example by himself that there is contentment possible for each and every one of us, no matter what situation we're in, because of Jesus Christ. We just sang how it's all about Christ in me, and that is 100% true. There is a level of contentment that all of us should experience, all of us Christians should experience because of what Jesus Christ has done on the cross and on our behalf, and we can celebrate that and sing about that. However, as we're going to look at the book of Ruth, the 3rd chapter today, you can open it now as I speak about it, we're going to see that during our time here in this life, there is what I'm going to call over and over again, godly discontentment, that all of us should feel. Now that sounds like I've just given kind of an oxymoron, godly discontentment. But they're really two different subjects. One is our ultimate contentment in Jesus Christ and what he's done. But this godly discontentment that we're going to see in our passage today is really about our walk in this world, how we are experiencing it. And I think all of us would agree with this. I don't think I have to convince you too much that there's various ways that all of us should experience godly discontentment. One of that, in a negative light, is with sin. If we're trapped in sin, if we're constantly in sin, whatever the sin is, whether it's anger or some sort of habitual sin, we should have a measure of godly discontentment in our lives about that. Hebrews speaks very clearly towards this. Consider Jesus, who endured from sinners such hostility against himself, so that you may not grow weary or faint-hearted in your struggle against sin. You have not yet resisted to the point of shedding your blood. So we see in this life we have now that we do struggle with sin, all of us do. We should have a measure of godly discontentment towards our life as we sin. And we should strive to, in step with the Holy Spirit, to live righteously. Now, it's not going to be possible fully until we leave this world, but there is a level of godly discontentment all of us should experience as we seek to be more like Christ in shedding that sinful nature. But not only the negative side of sin, there's also a positive side of godly discontentment that we should feel and experience. And that's when God has laid out provisions and plans and commands for us to benefit from and enjoy and live out, and we're not living them out. I'll give you a quick example. In the Old Testament, this was strict law. In the New Testament, under Jesus Christ, it's not as strict. But typically, Sundays are the Sabbath day, also known as the day of rest, right? Now, a day of rest is something that secular scholars, and of course Christian scholars, have come to understand that is a very valuable thing for people, no matter who you are, to experience a level of rest. Now, if you are go, you've got to work 7 days a week, it's tough, it's nonstop, that might need to happen for a time, but even in that time, there should be a level of godly discontent where you recognize this isn't the life that God has set out for you to live. Do you track with me there? There is commands in Scripture that if we embrace, they're actually for our benefit, and if we're not embracing those, there should be a level of godly discontent. Like, God, I know this could be better. And regarding, the Sabbath, I know a lot of you are on shift work, and it's troubling, it's difficult to do in our day and age, but the challenge is still there. We need to rest. And I'd hope as much as we can participate in that. So ultimately, in our identity as children of God and saved through the blood of Jesus Christ, we are content. There's a level of contentment that goes beyond anything we could experience in this life. But then day to day, there's a measure of godly discontentment that we have to kind of wrestle with through this life. As we look in Ruth 3, we're going to see that godly discontentment shows up. Just the very first verse. Then Naomi, Ruth's mother-in-law, said to her, "My daughter, should I not seek rest for you, that it may be well with you?" See, last week we saw some incredible, I would say really miraculous meetups and work where Ruth and Naomi have just moved into this, back to Israel, where it's Naomi's homeland. But Ruth is a stranger. She's a Moabite. She's really from the enemy nation. But she married Naomi's son, who's now passed away. And so there's these two widows, a mother-in-law and a daughter-in-law, that move back to Bethlehem. And Ruth makes a commitment and decision that she needs to go. And as the law allowed poor people to glean and pick off the leftovers of the fields, even though they didn't own the fields, but after harvest, the poor, biblically speaking, were allowed to go and harvest what was still accessible. And Ruth did that, and we read this incredible story of a 24-hour period where they had nothing. They were hungry, and then they were given incredible plenty. And God used a man, Boaz, which we were introduced to last week, to bring that about. And having just seen this miraculous provision of God for Naomi and also Ruth's needs, I think Naomi starts to see and trust that God hasn't given up on her yet. Chapter 1, we saw 10 years of trials and struggles that Naomi endured and faced, eventually giving up and having to return, feeling isolated, an outcast, poor, she's a widow. And yet there's something that seems to change in this fact, because she previously was someone that wanted to be called, "Don't call me Naomi," which means pleasant. She told her people, "From now on, call me bitter, because the Lord's against me." And when Ruth says, "I need to go out and glean so we can eat something," she's clearly fearful. She doesn't know what's going to happen to Ruth if she goes out. And so it was actually Ruth that came up with this plan to go and glean. But something has changed in this passage where suddenly Naomi's faith seems to be resurrected to some extent. Where she is the one that sees, God's not done with us yet. And she sees Ruth as someone that she deeply cares for and loves for. So I would say Naomi is experiencing a measure of godly discontent on Ruth's behalf. See, although right at this point in time, Ruth is able to go out to the fields on her hands and knees, she's a young woman at this point, and harvest what she can, Naomi is fully aware, because she is not physically capable of doing that, it appears. And she's fully aware that eventually she's going to be gone, and Ruth is not going to be able to do this anymore. And where will Ruth be then? So she says this, "Should I not seek rest for you, that it may go well with you?" Now, a common thing that I hear over and over is all about retirement. Now, I'm looking out, and I see some of you are retired. Some of you are not retired, and you're constantly hearing about how important it is. Save right now, RRSPs, CCPs, pay off that house, all these things. And today we have some great avenues for retirement. But this is biblical times. They didn't really have retirement per se. You got too old and unable to do the physical labor necessary. And so their retirement plan, which maybe is some of yours, was to be taken care of by their kids. I say that jokingly, but don't take it too serious. But that was essentially all the retirement options biblical, the people in the biblical times had, was once they got too old to labor and do the work for themselves, they were relying on their kids. Now look at Naomi. She's being taken care of by Ruth, which is a huge blessing. But who is going to take care of Ruth? There's nobody there. Once Naomi's gone and Ruth starts to age, she's going to be in deep trouble. Not only that, but I would expect Naomi's looking at this life that Ruth and her have, where she has to go out to the fields. And although God has been incredibly gracious and generous with providing them with more than enough food, she recognizes that maybe God's got more for her. God's been gracious, yes, but maybe there's more for her. So she talks to Ruth and says, "Ruth, should I not seek rest for you, that it may go well with you?" In the next verses, we see Naomi has a plan. which again is really an act of faith, because previously we saw that Naomi just seemed to be the lowest of the low, and she did not really expect anything from God. But now she seems to understand, having seen Ruth's commitment, seeing Boaz's response of being a loving and godly man, she starts to work this plan out in her mind. We can read about it in these next verses. Verse 2, "Is not Boaz, our relative, with whose young women you were? See, he is winnowing barley tonight at the threshing floor. Wash, therefore, and anoint yourself, and put on your cloak, and go down to the threshing floor. But do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. But when he lies down, observe the place where he lies, then go and uncover his feet, and lie down, and he will tell you what to do." See, after Naomi's seen what's happened over this harvest season, because it's been a few months of harvest, that Ruth has gotten to know Boaz's crew at the very least, and been protected by Boaz and his workers, Naomi seems to work out this plan that, Boaz is one of our redeemers, which I'll speak of. Well, I can talk about that now, but Boaz is a relative of Ruth and Naomi's deceased husbands. In biblical times, especially the nation of Israel specifically, having a male child was key to ensure stability within the country. And how that would work is the way Israel started was they took over this big nation, and God, essentially using his people, Moses and leaders, split up the nation into the tribes. And in those little tribes, you can think of them like provinces, they were split up even further into families and clans. And each of those individual families were given a piece of the property. And that piece was permanently theirs. That family was to farm that piece, take care of it, and it was always going to be theirs. Now, as we know, we all hit troubled times financially, and sometimes those families had to essentially loan out their property to others. But there came a time, it was called the Year of Jubilee, where there was basically a reset button. Whoever initially owned that property, it would revert back to that family. Now the trouble was that it was always, in this culture, it was always a male that took over that family property. And so Naomi is thinking, one, that God has already provided through this law of gleaning for the poor, but she's reminded of, two, there's another law for the sake of widows and the sake of maintaining a family line and these the property boundaries, where we can read about it in Deuteronomy 25, 5-6. If brothers dwell together, so it's talking about if there's family together, and one of them dies and has no son, the wife of the dead man shall not be married outside the family to a stranger. Her husband's brother shall go into her and take her as his wife, and perform the duty of a husband's brother to her. And the first son whom she bears shall succeed the name of his dead brother, that his name may not be blotted out of Israel. So I'm sure if you're new to the church or the Old Testament, that seems very strange. But this was a way that God had initially instated for his people in the Old Testament to maintain family lines, where if a wife is married to an Israelite and that Israelite dies before they can have children, specifically a son, then it was the expectation of that deceased man's family to step in and marry this widow so that she could have children herself. Now, as I mentioned in the weeks past, that this is the time of Judges where things are not being followed necessarily letter according to the law, right? Like, people are doing what's right in their own eyes. There's a lot of chaos at this time. There is no king. There's not much of respect for God, except there are clearly some, like Boaz, who does still respect the law. But Naomi recognizes that, God, you've provided for us through this law for the poor and the sojourner, and now, God, maybe you will provide for my daughter-in-law Ruth through this other law, where someone can step in and be that redeemer on her behalf, and ultimately also for Naomi's behalf. So Naomi comes up with this plan, and it's a bold, kind of scary plan, where she has some insight that tonight is the night that actually Boaz and his crew are going to be down at the threshing floor. This was a community, they still have these in certain countries. This was a community solid pad of ground where they would come and they'd bring, at this point, their barley, and they'd thrash it, and they'd break it up. And then they'd take that barley, and they'd basically pick it up with a big scoop and throw it up, and the chaff, which is the non-edible stuff, it would blow away. So they're kind of in a field. It would blow away, and then the heavy stuff, which is the edible barley, would drop. And Naomi says, I know that tonight's Boaz's night at the community threshing ground. And so she comes up with this plan. The first step of the plan is, Ruth, you've got to clean yourself up. Right? Like what we all do, whether it's a job interview or a date, whatever we do, we want to look our best, right? We want to put our best foot forward. We want to present ourselves, make a good impression. And even some commentators would say at this point, Ruth could be still wearing her grieving widow clothes. And that might very well be. We're not told for sure. But if that's the case, Naomi's saying, Ruth, you need to move on. Dress appropriately, wash yourself, show that you are actually interested in moving on in marriage. That's step one. Then she says, as Boaz and his crew are doing the thrashing and the winnowing, and she says, don't go and interrupt. Just wait, watch from a distance. And as it starts to get dark, and this is a time of celebration. This is harvest. This is like the last stage of harvest, right? They've worked hard all harvest. Now they're doing the last stage, and clearly it's a time of celebration because they're going to be eating together, laughing together, drinking together, not to get drunk, but drinking together as was common. It says just watch. Don't interrupt it. Just watch for, as it starts to get dark, where does Boaz go? And then as the party settles down, Naomi tells Ruth, it's at that point, when it's dark, you know where Boaz is, you're picking the right guy, that you are to go and lay down at his feet and uncover his feet. Now, I did a bunch of research of why did she uncover the feet. You know, stinky feet that's just been working hard. And no one really knows. The best guess we have right now is that it was intended to have him gently wake up without being startled. You can imagine after just celebrating and doing this harvesting and winnowing and thrashing, that as you lay down and then there's suddenly a woman there shaking you, that would startle you. So this is a gentle approach, possibly, to having him wake up. As the cold falls and his feet are exposed, he kind of rouses a bit and wakes up. So here's the plan, and it's a risky plan. There's a couple risks involved. One, what is the reaction of Boaz going to be? So far, Boaz has been very generous, very kind to Ruth, but maybe this is quite a bold step to take. And there is a risk that having done this, they might not be able to go back to their working relationship they previously had. There's also a risk, as we're going to see shortly, that this could lead to Ruth marrying someone that she has no clue who they are. There's risks involved. But I do think that as we experience godly discontentment, and we have to make plans and take steps to face that, there's going to be risks. But if God has led us to change certain things in our life, to help others change certain things, we can be confident that if it's God's will for our life, then there's good that's going to come out of it. It might not go exactly as we expect, but just because it's a risk doesn't mean we don't do it. And that's what Naomi and Ruth recognize here. So Ruth responds to this, what appears kind of crazy plan. All that you say, I will do. So then the next verses we can see the plan is put into action. Verse 6. So she went down to the threshing floor and did just as her mother-in-law had commanded her. And when Boaz had eaten and drunk and his heart was merry, he went to lie down at the end of the heap of grain. Then she came softly and uncovered his feet and lay down. At midnight, the man was startled and turned over, and behold, a woman lay at his feet. He said, "Who are you?" And she answered, "I am Ruth, your servant," or your maidservant. "Spread your wings over your servant, for you are a redeemer." Let's stop there for a minute. This seems, we read this and we might get a little uncomfortable with this scene. But you got to note that this word wings, it can mean garments, and there might be some implied invitation there. But we've already seen this word previously where Boaz recognizes, it's in chapter 2, verse 12, where Boaz specifically says, Ruth, you are a worthy woman, you've left your people, and you've come to be under the wings of the God of Israel. You've come to take refuge amongst the one true God. And Boaz essentially says, that's honorable. And here, Ruth is expressing, Boaz, I'm part of this people now, and I'm ready to take refuge with you, with your family. She's expressing this really bold proposal that she would like to be under his care, in his family, married to him. And it's important to recognize that she doesn't just, put herself out there, but she specifies that this is according to God's law. This is what God has allowed to happen. She says, for you are a redeemer. This is a good thing. It's not just anyone. This is specifically who God has put in place to be the redeemer of Ruth and ultimately Naomi as well. And Ruth's heart must have been pounding because she's just carried out the plan. She's had to ad-lib it a little bit because she didn't really know how the response would be. But having done that, her heart's pounding. She doesn't know how Boaz is going to react. Is it going to be as she expects? Verse 10, and he said, may you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. You have made this last kindness greater than the first, in that you have not gone after young men, whether rich or poor. And now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you all that you ask. For all my fellow townsmen know that you are a worthy woman. And now it is true that I am a redeemer, yet there is a redeemer nearer than I. Remain tonight, and in the morning, if he will redeem you, good, let him do it. But if he is not willing to redeem you, then, as the Lord lives, I will redeem you. Lie down until the morning. Now, first of all, that's an unexpected response. I'm sure Ruth had no clue that there was someone else that actually took priority. And sometimes that's going to be our experience as well. As we make a plan, we try and deal with whatever God's laid on our heart that needs to be dealt with, and it doesn't go as according to plan. But just thinking about Boaz's response here, just to look at Boaz for a minute, because he is kind of a representative of Christ saving the world. That's part of what's going on here. But I love Boaz's responses for two reasons. One is he is incredibly honored and blessed by her proposal. Despite having a crew of people, despite this great harvest he's just had, despite being a helper of the poor, he sees himself very humbly. I think as we think about those that come to mind when I say the word excellent, worthy people, people of great character, that is probably something that comes to mind that would describe them, as they're humble. Yes, in our minds, they're amazing people, but they don't flaunt that. And that's Boaz. He is honored that she would see him as someone that she wants to be with. That leads me to the second thing, is that Boaz is not only deeply flattered that Ruth sees him as someone she wants to be with for life, but there's actually this reciprocal value in each other. Do you see that? So Boaz, like Ruth is here, putting it all out there, being like, this is weird, but I want to marry you. And Boaz is he's absolutely flattered. And he's like, but you are such a catch, right? Like any guy would want to be with you. Why do you want to be with me? And it's I think this is it really hints at a healthy marriage today, right? Where one's not like, yeah, you're lucky to have me, right? It's this mutual value, like, no, you're amazing. No, you're amazing. And that's what we see here where, Boaz could have been like, oh, Ruth, you're a Moabite. You're a widow. You're poor. You don't have a whole lot going for you. No, he says, you're amazing. Any guy would be lucky to have you. And on the flip side, Ruth could have been like, he's a little bit old. He's got things going on. I want someone that's a little more interesting. No, she says, he's an amazing man. I want this. I think it's a great testament for us that are currently married, those of you that are interested in marriage, that this is a two-way street, right? And maybe that's challenging for you today if you are married, that look at your spouse as an absolutely gem and jewel from God. We see that in here. But, as I said, verse 12 brings some troubling news, that there is unknown, unnamed relative that actually, according to the law of God, takes priority before Boaz can take that step. And so rightfully so, he says, I will deal with this, but at this point I can't redeem you. I have to allow the law of God to work itself out. But what's amazing here is he does make a promise to her. He actually confirms it with an oath, saying that, yes, Ruth, you're right. I am a redeemer, but I'm not the closest one to you. By the law of God, there's someone else that has to decide not to take that role, not to do their actual responsibility before Boaz can do it. And that maybe was terrifying for Ruth. But what he does say is that Boaz says, if he will redeem you, good, let him do it. But if he is not willing to redeem you, then as the Lord lives, I will redeem you. The plan's not gone exactly according to how they expected or wanted. But what is clear here is Ruth and Naomi are going to experience some sort of redemption. They're going to be welcomed into a family one way or another. And in that, you can see God is working behind the scenes. God has been clearly working on the heart of Boaz. I think even the fact that he knows there's someone else closer, to me, screams that he has been considering this as a possibility. He has seen Ruth, to some extent, as an amazing woman, but he knows it's not his place to step into that role because there is someone closer. And yet he values her so much to make this commitment, saying, you know what, Ruth, I'm all for this. But we got to go through the proper channels. As we know, he's an honorable man. He's a worthy man, a man of excellent character. But he promises that whatever happens, Ruth, you will be redeemed. He does tell her, you need to lay here till morning, and I think that's just a practical step. That's not something weird. It is pitch black. This is, not a necessarily safe environment, and Ruth is going to be safe as long as she's with safe people, and so she remains with Boaz until the morning. We'll finish the chapter here, verse 14. So she lay at his feet until morning, but arose before one could recognize another. And he said, let it not be known that the woman came to the threshing floor. And he said, bring the garment you are wearing and hold it out. So she held it, and he measured out 6 measures of barley and put it on her. Then she went into the city. When she came to her mother-in-law, she said, how did you fare, my daughter? And then she told her all that the man had done for her, saying, these 6 measures of barley he gave to me. For he said to me, you must not go back empty-handed to your mother-in-law. She replied, wait, my daughter, until you learn how the matter turns out, for the man will not rest, but he will settle the matter today. We see again, Boaz, as a worthy man, is seeking to shield her reputation to some extent. Obviously, rumors could have flown at what just happened. We know the truth. We know that nothing weird happened that night. But for Ruth's sake, and probably for Boaz as well, he says, let's, guys, you work for me. Let's keep this quiet. But in a way of confirming his oath to Ruth and to Naomi, he gives this generous provision of barley. once again. Barley keeps coming up in the story. So Ruth returns home and gives the insight to her mother-in-law, Naomi. And Naomi's probably just like, how did it go? How did it go? Where are we at? And Ruth shares this. And Naomi says, well, I know what happens now, and this is not going to be a long pause. Life is difficult. Sometimes it always feels like the grass is greener on the other side. Life is hard. Things are going to come that we don't agree with, we don't love, and we do have a measure of contentment no matter what comes our way because of Jesus Christ bringing us into his family, and that we can celebrate and be thankful. But as we live these days, there is godly discontentment that is right for us to feel. Again, when it comes to sin, we should never be content when sin is in our life, seeking to follow the way of Jesus and putting that sin to death. But also, when it comes to living the life God has given us, there should be a measure of godly discontentment if we're not experiencing that life. I love what Jesus says in John 10:10. The thief comes only to steal, kill, and destroy. I came that they may have life and have it abundantly. Now, how would you describe an abundant life? Maybe you need to reflect on that. That doesn't mean a rich life, you're driving Lamborghinis, nothing like that. Rich people are not necessarily thriving. An abundant life is experiencing deep and inner joy and peace and assurance that God is so good. In 1 Corinthians 7:15, for those of us that are married and you're wondering, my marriage is just not what I want it to be, we see Paul make this little comment, 1 Corinthians 7:15, that God has called us to peace. And in other parts, in Philippians 4, it talks about the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ. If you are here today and not experiencing peace, it doesn't mean life is going swimmingly, but it does mean God longs for you to experience a measure of peace and gratitude and comfort in this life. I'd like us to, I don't do this often, but take just a few moments and reflect on what's God been saying to you. What's some godly discontentment that's starting to arise within your own minds and hearts? Some things that you think you could make a plan and actually address these things that are holding you back from experiencing more of what God longs for you to experience, what Jesus declares of experiencing an abundant life. I'll give you some examples as my head has been swirling through this. One is how you respond in your marriage. There's always things that we can be improving on. Maybe it's how you are raising your kids and you think, man, I really wish I could be praying more with my kids, but it just seems so awkward. Well, take that as godly discontentment, where take those steps of being willing to step in there and be like, before you go to bed, let's just pray. Before our meal time, I know it's maybe a little strange, but let's thank God for this food. Maybe it's other things, like you recognize you've been prioritizing something way more than it should be. Marks, looks, popularity, job status. And this has been such a focus of yours, and you recognize it doesn't deserve that much of my mind. So you can start making plans to be praying through that. Like, God, let me see my school and my friends, my job in the right light. There's a godly discontentment if we're prioritizing the wrong thing. Maybe it's how you're using your time. Maybe it's the shows that you're watching that these aren't actually very helpful. However, God is prodding you into this godly discontentment. He promises that He has something better for you. It might be risky. It might not go exactly according to plan, as we see this interchange between Ruth and Boaz does not go according to plan fully. But we know that if God is encouraging it, that God is prodding you to do that, it is going to somehow work out for a better, more fulfilled, more abundant life, as Jesus promises. Let me close in prayer.